Good morning and welcome back to St. Anselm's Abbey's interview series. Very glad to have Brother Matthew here with us today. Brother Matthew is one of the only, or very few people that I know that did not give in to the zeitgeist and are refusing to use any technology, which I have a lot of respect for. So no email, no cell phone whatsoever. You're free as a bird and unpolluted by the media.
That's
Well, well done. I believe, Brother Matthew, you're also probably the only person in this house with an Ivy League education. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, no, it isn't really. I did graduate work at Columbia University, which is, I suppose, technically an Ivy League school, but
Yeah.
my undergraduate was at Fordham, which is a perfectly fine Jesuit college, but not an Ivy League school.
Yeah. Good. Well, that takes us exactly back to your origins. So you are from Long Island, New York.
That's
Can you
correct.
Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about your upbringing there. And
Well, I grew up in Great Neck, which is the first suburb over the city line going east from New York City. And my parents were both from elsewhere. They were from the West. My mother was from Denver and my father was from Iowa. And Great Neck was sort of a strange place because it was it had been a kind of artistic, different suburb. It had well the most famous writer there was it's my age.
no worries.
Anyway, a lot of the families that I knew in Great Neck were people who had been in the arts or had kind of graduated from working class sort of careers in New York City and become suburbanites. And it was a very sort of challenging kind of academic environment, even in the public school. It was very, very competitive. Anyway, and I went to a progressive school in Ohio to start out with, and then I ended up transferring to Fordham University, where I finished my undergraduate, and then I went to Columbia University. And I suppose what you're interested in is what brought me here.
Eventually, yeah, but I'll also be happy to hear about what your major was.
Oh, I was a major in history.
Okay.
I was also very interested in languages, and so I made an effort in that direction. And I was sort of a restless university student, and I took advantage of all travel programs that they offered. So I spent some time in Mexico, and I spent a year in France, and finally I returned to New York, finished up at Fordham University, and then went on to do graduate work at Columbia and whatever. So that was my background. I was, for a person in this life, I had an unusual background. Today it would not be unusual, but back then most people in the religious life had a Catholic parochial education, and I didn't have that. And I had in sort of the back of my mind an attraction to monasticism, about which I knew very, very little. I mean, the nearest I had gotten to being in a monastery was the Cloisters Museum in Upper Manhattan, which you probably know. And so, how can I put it? I never went through the normal steps that people go through who have a goal in mind, in the monastic life. But it was there, and as time went on, it became more present to me as what I was really interested in, what I was really looking for. But as I say, I didn't have the kind of background that would normally have shunted me in that direction. My only Catholic education at school had been Fordham University, which is run by the Jesuits. So it was only after I'd gotten out of graduate school and taken a job in the publishing business that I began to think about a little more seriously the monastic life. I knew absolutely nothing about it, and at a certain point, I felt that I could no longer fight off this urge, and I called up the archdiocese to find out if there were any monasteries in New York, and they said no. And they said the nearest one was at Newark, in New Jersey. So I called them up and made an appointment, and I had a conference with the novice master, and I was given a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict, and it was to me a very moving experience, a very routine experience for a lot of people, I'm sure, but for me it was a very moving experience. And as I was reading this paperback copy of the Rule of St. Benedict on the train as I was coming back to New York, it's a 15-minute ride, I began to cry. And I had the feeling that the voice speaking in the book was speaking to me personally, directly. And as I thought about it later, I realized that it was a mixture of a great longing and a certain fear. I knew that this would in fact win if I gave it any chance of doing so. And I kind of pushed it aside. And it was quite some years before it came to the surface as the winning, option for me. And by the time I actually made up my mind that this is what I wanted to do and I was not going to put it off any longer, I was told that I was too old. I was over the age, which 30 was the age pretty much that you wouldn't even dream of making an application back then beyond. So so I started on a campaign of trying to find a place that would take me at that age. The Newark Abbey, which I visited, was perfectly suitable place to start a search like this, but they weren't looking at people my age at that point. And this went on for a while, until finally I remember seeing on television a broadcast of a film that a woman had made of interviews with monks at Spencer Abbey in Massachusetts, okay, which is a Trappist house. And I watched it with a certain interest. The film wasn't particularly, well made or anything like that, but it was to me fascinating because it was the inside of a place that I had in my sights. And after seeing this, I said to myself, the one thing I've learned from this film is that although these people are Trappist monks, they're talking to this filmmaker. They can talk, which I had never realized there were exceptions made. And I learned at that point that the Trappists were not totally closed to human communication, which is the thing about them that I would have felt was a barrier. So I wrote to Spencer Abbey, and they told me that I was too old and that I could not apply there, but they sent me a list of all the other monasteries that were in their congregation in North America. And I began to go through the list. It was alphabetical, and the first monastery on the list was in upstate New York. It was at Genesee, and it was a monastery that I knew something about because I had read Henri Nouwen's book about his retreat at Genesee. And I recalled in that account, he mentioned that one day when he was working, the abbot of Genesee came to him as a retreatant and said, Father Henri, if you wish to make a serious retreat in a monastery, you're going to have to stop reading your New York Review books. Cancel your subscription. And I said to myself, I'm not canceling my subscription to New York Review books. So I struck that off the list. And the next one on the list was an obscure monastery in Berryville, Virginia. So I wrote them, and I got back a handwritten, slightly scrawled letter saying, and I told them in the letter everything that I thought would be a problem, about my application. And they said, your age doesn't sound very good, but come down and we'll talk anyway, the man said, okay? It was Father William. And so I arranged to come down and visit, and I made a retreat there, and I stayed there for some months. And in the course of the retreat, I went to speak to the abbot, and I told him that I was going to make an application to join the monastery. And the abbot said, in the course of this interview, there's been a state of certain amount of consternation. He said, why does the Holy Spirit keep sending us people 40, 45, impossible ages? And I recounted all this to Father William, the man who had written me the note, and Father William said, well, he said the Holy Spirit sent you. So I said, okay, I will proceed on that. So I did, and I applied, and I was told that I could, become a novice in that house. And I loved it. I loved the life. I loved the work that they did. I loved the place. And I was happy there. But I also realized that even though they were different from the Trappist, the classic Trappist sort of lifestyle that I had heard about, the distance and the degree of avoidance of things like regular conversation and whatever was going to be a real problem for me. I could probably live there happily for a few years, but I couldn't see the rest of my life being quite so removed, from other people in the world and whatever. And I began to think about possibly moving to another place. And that's where I ended up looking into this house. The abbot of Berryville, who had been opposed to my application, he had decided that I was in fact perfectly suitable for that monastery, and didn't see any reason at all why I should look to a slightly different kind of monastic life. And he forbade me to make telephone calls, write letters, or do anything that would communicate my interest in maybe shifting to another house. And that went on. He had me come into his office and kneel on the floor, and he would fire these questions at me. Did you write any letters? Did you make any phone calls? No, Reverend Father, in due obedience, I have not. And finally, after some months of this, on one occasion, when he fired the questions at me, I said, I said, actually, yes, I am going to contact the monastery in Washington. And he said, well, if they're any different from what we are, then they're not monks. So I said, well, whatever. In the end, he relented and allowed me to make a visit to this house. And as the expression would go, the rest is history. I came here, and it was not an easy entrance, and it was not an easy training I got, in the novitiate and whatnot, but it all worked out. So.
And so, upon your arrival here, how soon after that did you start teaching at the school? You were the Spanish, or still are the Spanish?
No, I'm not teaching Spanish. It was probably a year and a half, something like that. Our abbot at that point here was Father Leonard, God rest him, who's an Englishman who went back to England to head up his monastery, and he was a very genial person. We got along very well, and I became his secretary. Oh. And I used to go into his office every morning and take letters and whatever. And on one occasion, he said to me, that he wanted me to do a special job of work as a novice. Whatever came up. He said, in this country, unlike England, people don't take very good care of wasteland, forests, woods, this kind of thing. And I noticed that our woods around the property here are filled with trash and trees that need pruning and whatever. He said, would you please clean up all the detritus and trash and whatever around the monastic woods? So I devoted 1.5 years to doing this. I must have removed about 300 jumbo garbage bags from our woods and tossed them out. It was an enormous slew of items, but there was no. That was my full-time job for that time, and after that, when I more or less finished with that job, it was suggested that I should talk to the headmaster about possibility of being a school teacher. And they were beginning to have problems placing people in the school because the requirements of high school teachers had kind of like risen over the course of years, and not everybody necessarily would know something that could be taught in the high school. So I went to the headmaster, and he mentioned various things, and he said, "What is it that you could teach?" And I said, "Well," I learned Spanish when I was in college, and I think I became fairly fluent in that language. I think I could teach that. I was a major in history. I think I could teach that. Various things came up, and so they told me that they were thinking of dropping Spanish because the French was the required language and German was a second option, and they didn't see any particular reason for keeping Spanish on the list. I said, do not drop that language. I said, it's going to become increasingly important over the next few years, and high schools of any rank are going to have to offer it, for a number of years, and I'd be perfectly happy to take over that. And so anyway, he checked and discovered that, in fact, yes, they were having problems replacing their Spanish teacher. And so that's why I was given that job. And I kind of followed the students through. We started out with the beginning classes, and I just kept, in the end, we had to hire, of course, more people to take the rest of the classes. So I ended up becoming the Spanish teacher in our school. It wasn't a career that I had, set as a goal, but it's what I ended up doing, and I enjoyed it. It was challenging, but it was a good job. I did briefly teach history also because they had some problems finding someone who could do non-Western history. So I went to the University of Maryland, found out what they were offering, and got textbooks and whatever, and I offered that for a while too. So.
So for how long did you teach altogether, approximately?
Approximately 34 years, I think, something like that, maybe 33. Yeah. I was there for quite some time. Some time.
And so these days, I guess you're retired for maybe about a year, a little over.
A little over, yeah.
Yeah. So what are your days filled with other than, of course, your monastic duties? I know that you're an enthusiastic swimmer.
Yes, I do try to go swimming at least once a week. I still have some responsibilities in the monastery. I select a reading for at Vespers every day. Every weekday, the readings are all readings that I provide. So I've got to continue to research, and find those things. I edit the newsletter, so that's something.
Sure.
A variety of things along those lines.
Are you involved in any extent with the Oblate?
No, I'm not. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't.
I see.
One of my sort of questions here had been, I had never felt a particular vocation to the priesthood, and when I came here, it became apparent to me that they assumed that all applicants to join this monastery were priestly candidates. And yet they had changed their policies to make that optional rather than required. And so there was coursework that novices were expected to, get through. And when they realized that I was not interested in being a priest, as I asked the abbot at that point, Father Leonard, said, "When are you going to start your priestly studies?" And I said, "Well, never, Father, unless you order me to. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to go for priestly studies, but I have no particular vocation to the priesthood." And he said, "Oh, well, that's fine. That's the way things are, So that was an opportunity to take university classes in the graduate level that were not in the regular syllabus for priestly candidates. And as a matter of fact, I had a much more interesting set of, possibilities than I would have had I been enrolled as a prospective priest. I would have had to take a certain defined list of progression classes and whatever. So anyway, so that's where I am.
That's great. You mentioned before a couple of the study abroad trips. Mm-hmm. I'm sure some of those also have unusual, maybe even transportation stories or so. I presume you have traveled with a ship? Or
Oh, yes. I mean, this is an earlier age. When I was an undergraduate, I spent some time in Mexico, which was, while I was an undergraduate. And then I opted to go to Europe for a year, which is what I did in my junior year. I went to France and I lived in Besançon, and that was a great experience. So yeah.
So have you actually crossed the Atlantic on the ship?
Yes, indeed I did. I mean, I went over on a ship and I came back on a ship. The ship I went over on had a lot of students on it. It was a regular student transport sort of thing. And the ship I came back on was a Genoese liner. It was quite small. It was really sort of like a large ferry boat, but it had hundreds of immigrants from Eastern Europe who were looking for work in Canada or the United States or whatever. And I was one of the few people who wasn't in that category. And it took us 12 days to cross the Atlantic. Wow. And most of the people on the ship were sick most of the time because they had never been to sea, and the thing rocked, back and forth, and they were very uncomfortable. I loved the ocean. I mean, it was wonderful for me. So yeah, I had a very interesting experience. There.
And when one leaves for a year abroad, and we're talking pre-credit cards and Venmo and etc., how does it work with figuring out your finances?
Well, it's a question that we used international travelers checks. Okay. And the only time, I mean, you just carried as though it were, money in your wallet. But the only time that it really produced a problem was I was in Paris. I had a job outside of Paris, and I had a few weeks break before I started my classes at the University of Besançon. And so I decided to travel. So I went to the Gare du Nord in Paris, and I asked, I didn't really know where I wanted to go, so I asked him, sell me a ticket to the end of the line on the next train leaving. And he did. I had my luggage, and I got on the train, and I found myself in a little compartment with 7 other people who were mostly Italians and Spaniards and whatever. And I asked one of them, I said, where are we going? And this woman told me that, well, she didn't know, but she was going to get off in Hamburg. And, it went on in that vein. Well, it turned out I got sleepy at a certain point, and I decided to lie down because many of the people had already vacated to go to their various stops. And a Hungarian priest came in. We talked a little bit, and then he lay down and he began to snore. And I decided to leave the compartment, and I went into the next room where there was a little more room and when I woke up and went back to the place that I had left my luggage, they had changed the decor of the car. I couldn't figure out what had happened until finally I realized that the cars had been separated and that my luggage was on a different car from the one that I was in. And so and back then, not so many people spoke English. So, I mean, I had to find somebody who could, I could communicate in English or French with. And they told me, get off at the next stop and ask the, man at the station. I did. And he checked his records and he discovered that the car that I had left my luggage in had been transported to Kaliningrad in the Soviet Union, okay? And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? And they said, go to the train station, get off at Copenhagen, go to the train station and register as, the owner of the lost luggage. And I did. And I had to find a hotel that would accept my staying there as a matter of my paying once my luggage came back, because I had also put my traveler's checks in the luggage that had been lost. So I was 5 days in Copenhagen without anything, and again, it was an interesting enough experience. And eventually, the luggage did show up, and I was able to pay off the hotel bill and whatever. And at that point, I telegraphed my father, because his parents were from Sweden, and I said, I'm really just across a tiny little span of water from Sweden. Who do we have? And he gave me a list of the people that he didn't know, but he had received lists of whatever. So I traveled all over Sweden, visited all these relatives, and whatever, and it was an interesting experience. So.
Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that, and I'm not sure I'm curious enough now to just go to a train station and ask for a ticket. To
the end of the line.
End of the line, but
right.
Who knows? Maybe I will try out someday.
Yeah, well, I don't think you can get away with quite that kind of free-form, traveling that we used to do back then.
Well, just to wrap it up, wrap it all together, would you have an advice for some of the young men out there who are possibly discerning their vocation, from your personal experience or from your years having spent here? What are a couple to-dos or not to-dos?
Well, I think it's a question of you have to look into your heart and find what it is that you really want. And I, at the point that I told you I came to this house, I had already determined that this was what I really wanted. I'd had a career in the publishing business. I had years of study. I'd had a lot of travel. And I was perfectly pleased living in New York, but there was something else that I wanted even more than any of these things. And I became very, very firmly committed to that as a goal, even though the barrier had been raised. I had been told by a number of people, you are absolutely unacceptable because of your age, and that we never accept people beyond a certain point. But in fact, I did come to this house, and despite reluctance, I was allowed to stay, and I'm still here. And it's a question of finding what's inside of you, in your heart, and what it is that God is telling you He has on offer for you, if you're willing to persevere. And that's what I did. I persevered.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Sure.
And thank you for taking your time and telling us your life story.
Most welcome.